Welcome to our Equilibrium Quarterly Bulletin. My name is Metula Sikakane and I am the Business Development Manager at Equilibrium Investment Management. Just some housekeeping. We applied for Continuous Professional Development or CPD points. It is important to please watch the session and add your ID number to the CPD section so we can verify your attendance. You may also view this event on this platform at any time until the end of June 2024 so that you can receive your CPD points. Our operations team will email you CPD certificate to you during July 2024. Please also feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section and our speakers will either answer them live or get back to you after this event. You will also find more information about our speakers under the speaker tab on the top menu bar, or if you scroll down and you can download the PDF presentation. Okay, let's kick off this session. First is our economist Sanisha Pakisami, who will discuss the political scenarios and the economic consequences.
Thank you, Metula. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The democratic stage is primed for a momentous year as an unprecedented supercycle of elections worldwide promises to reshape the political landscape in 2024. From established democracies grappling with rising populism and economic worries to fledgling democracies facing the test of legitimacy, voters in at least 64 countries will head to the polls this year. Among these are 8 of the most populous 10 countries in the world. This year's elections are set against a backdrop of rising authoritarianism. These are political systems that are characterized by limited civil liberties and centralized power. Although democracy is far from running out of steam, as was evident in Poland in October last year, surveys mark a retreat in democratic spirit. According to the Varieties of Democracy Institute, the quality of democracy enjoyed by an average global citizen in 2022 was back at the levels experienced in 1986. The perception of democracies being slow to respond to social demand has likely contributed to the splintering of the electorate away from centrist parties. In the post-World War global geopolitical structure, certain elections will hold significant importance. The headline election will be held in the United States in November this year, with a narrow result potentially inflaming existing tensions. Moreover, the European parliamentary elections in June could also deepen divisions, especially if radical right-wing parties gain more seats. While localized unrest is a key risk in this volatile geopolitical environment, there are wider-reaching consequences from these uncertain electoral outcomes for foreign policy, trade relations, and even global supply chains. South Africa stands as a microcosm of these global political trends. The upcoming general elections on 29 May hold the potential to profoundly reshape the nation's governance framework against a rising tide of global electoral uncertainty. Polls currently paint a precarious picture for the African National Congress, or the ANC, the nation's dominant party since the end of apartheid in 1994. The prospect of the ANC falling below 50% of the vote for the first time, as indicated by a number of opinion polling institutions, including the Brenthurst Foundation, the Social Research Foundation, and Ipsos, amongst others, is a stark reflection of growing public disillusionment. Deteriorating service delivery, crippling infrastructure woes, and a perceived lack of progress in tackling corruption have all eroded trust in the ruling party. Socioeconomic inequality and job scarcity, as well as an unequal opportunity to quality education, have created a view that democracy has not delivered a better life for all. In 2004, when the country celebrated a decade of freedom, 59% was satisfied with democracy. Now, only 22% are satisfied with how democracy is working in South Africa. The Human Sciences Research Council, or HSRC, notes that confidence in national government fell from 69% in 2004 to only 23% in 2022. Trust in Parliament dropped from 65% to a mere 21%, and trust in local government went from 48% to a paltry 25% in the same period. The HSRC notes that the biggest falls in confidence have unsurprisingly coincided with high-profile government scandals. In response to government's failures in adequately addressing the nation's economic and social ills, there has been a surge in the opposition party landscape, with over 350 parties registering for this year's South African elections. Now, many of these are led by former political figures who have defected from established parties aiming to capitalize on voter dissatisfaction. While this signifies a potentially vibrant democracy, it can also be interpreted as a symptom of deep-seated discontent with the existing political system, and this can lead to voter apathy. Global voter turnout has been in decline since the 1960s, partly owing to generational replacement, where older voters are more likely to view casting their ballot as a civic duty. Rising inequality also plays a significant role in discouraging citizens to vote. The level of voter engagement nevertheless meaningfully impacts the integrity of the democratic process. Research undertaken by the Journal of World Politics indicates that decreased voter turnout results in skewed socioeconomic representation, biased public policies, and reduced government accountability. It can even create conditions for increased patronage. Promisingly, the number of registered voters has increased appreciably in South Africa from 18.1 million in 1999 to a record 27.8 million registered voters for 2024. However, a significant portion may not participate in the vote. Out of the 26.8 million registered voters for the 2019 general elections, only 17.7 million votes were actually cast. This suggests that more than 9.1 million people did not turn out on the day to vote. This left voter turnout below 66%, largely driven by youth disenfranchisement, which we think can be attributed to unemployment, corruption, and poor service delivery. However, with this year's national and provincial elections more hotly contested than ever before, we could potentially see a revival in turnout levels with a higher number of youth registering to vote. The 18 to 39-year age band of registered voters accounts for more than 40% of the voters' roll this year. Moreover, the possibility of the ANC falling below 50% could rally the opposition base in the country's urban areas in particular. The potential shift in political power, as highlighted by recent polls, could usher in a multi-party governing landscape, possibly at a national level, which would be an historic first for South Africa. While progress towards democratic pluralism is a positive development, concerns linger. Coalitions have a checkered past at a local level, with many urban centres experiencing ineffective governance since 2016. After the 2021 elections, 70 municipalities experienced a hung council necessitating coalitions. Between 2021 and 2022, metropoles such as Nelson Mandela and Tshwane experienced a collapse in administration, which tarnished the nation's confidence in a multi-party democracy. While many coalitions at the metro level since 2016 have been notably unstable, there are nevertheless a number of well-functioning and stable coalitions established in municipalities throughout the country. The Government Performance Index, conducted by Good Governance Africa, factors in things like administration, governance, planning, management, and service delivery when ranking South Africa's municipalities. Standard Bank Group Securities, or SBG, highlights that out of the 20 top-performing municipalities of 2021, 4 were governed through coalition governments. A number of local government coalitions have experienced disintegration and a reconstitution in South Africa due to parties using them as a political battleground between elections. In comparison, constructively institutionalized versions of coalition governments have emerged where there's been a sense of shared national interest and policies. Global examples of successful coalition building include Austria, Germany, Japan, Malaysia, and Chile. The Centre for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg notes that coalitions can work more effectively in countries where there are first minimal ideological differences between parties, secondly where there hasn't been a dominant party in charge for a long time, and thirdly where opposition parties are not weak and fragmented. Programmatic alignment is thus crucial for coalition arrangements to be successful in South Africa. The national and provincial election outcomes are also likely to reflect new trends. A shift away from emotional loyalty to established parties has been evident in split voting trends. This is where voters strategically choose different parties for national, provincial, and local government ballots. This points to a more nuanced political landscape. The battle for urban areas will likely be fierce, with the ANC expected to retain dominance in rural areas. Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, however, stand out as potential battlegrounds where coalition governments at a provincial level seem likely. While uncertain at the time of filming, should the courts rule in favor of former President Jacob Zuma's Umkhonto weSizwe or MK party to remain on the ballot, they will pose a formidable threat in KwaZulu-Natal given the high concentration of the Zulu population in that province. With Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal accounting for 44% of the country's population and 49% of the country's GDP, election outcomes here are viewed as pivotal. The ANC's stronghold in the traditionally rural bases, nonetheless, will likely carry it comfortably over the 50% mark in provinces like the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, Northwest, and even Mpumalanga to a lesser degree, given the entrance of the MK party on a crowded political stage. Moreover, by-election data points to trouble for the official opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, or DA, in the Western Cape, as support for the Patriotic Alliance, the National Coloured Congress, and the Good Party have increased. Moreover, the DA's initial steadfast support for Israel in the Gaza war may see some voters defect to the ANC. Recent polling results suggest sustained pressure on the ANC. The results are also flagging limited growth for the DA and the Economic Freedom Fighters, with parties outside of the top three potentially collectively securing more than double their share of the vote compared with 2019. According to SPG Securities, a number of potential key election outcomes are on the table at the time of filming. In the most probable scenario, which SPG attributes a 60% probability of materializing, SPG notes that the ANC would garner between 43% and 47% of the national vote, requiring them to partner with a mid-sized coalition partner such as the Inkatha Freedom Party. In our view, if this scenario were to play out, it is likely that the direction and the pace of structural reform would be broadly kept intact given the closely linked ideologies of the ANC and the likely coalition partners under this scenario. In the next scenario, SPG Securities sees the ANC securing 48% or more of the votes. This scenario holds a 1 in 5 chance of occurring, according to SPG's analysis. If the ANC manages to get over the 50% line, they would not require a coalition partner. However, if they drop below it, they would need the support of a smaller party. While this would imply lesser control for the minority party, it would still allow for a strong coalition to govern the country. SPG notes that each 1% of the vote equates to 4 seats in parliament, so a 48% win by the ANC would require the votes of only 8 MPs to secure a majority in parliament. As such, the direction and pace of structural reform would, in our view, continue on the current path. In the remaining scenario, which holds a 20% probability of transpiring, the ANC gets less than 42% of the vote. A plethora of election outcomes could evolve from here. The most market-friendly of these outcomes would likely be an ANC-DA coalition, under which we would likely experience a step-up in governance and accountability, a crackdown on corruption, increased investor sentiment towards South Africa's economic prospects, and a revival in fixed investment. This would ultimately lead to a higher growth path for the country, enabling a reduction in unemployment and poverty. In an alternate outcome, the ANC could partner with the multi-party charter. SPG notes that under this scenario, there would be support to protect the Constitution and critical institutions such as the Reserve Bank, the South African Revenue Service, the National Prosecuting Authority, and National Treasury. While authorities would encourage private sector investment in this scenario, we believe that structural reform efforts would lag given the number of political constituents involved and their difference in views. SPG also considers the option of the ANC partnering with the EFF or the MK party, or even both, in the scenario where the ANC drops below 42%. In our view, this would result in the most economic damage, given some of the more radical views expressed in the EFF and MK parties' manifestos. A shift to the left in policies could result in a souring of international relations with the West, capital flight as confidence in SA's future growth plummets, and a more divisive society. In this scenario, we would likely see a lower fiscal restraint being exercised, debt soaring to higher levels, and a further weakening in the currency leading to elevated inflation. Moreover, any abrupt or unconstitutional changes could undermine the country's democratic institutions and its legal framework in this scenario. These resultant deficient socioeconomic outcomes would likely lead to a loss in support for this form of government by the time of the next general elections held in 2029. In the last alternative, under the scenario in which votes for the ANC fall below 42%, a minority government is considered. On the upside, a minority government allows for a higher level of accountability, given that key economic decisions require broader scrutiny and support. Additionally, a more inclusive outcome can be reached given the diversity of views involved. Nonetheless, a minority government comes with its own set of challenges, such as political instability when struggling to pass key pieces of legislation, or policy compromises leading to a watering down of growth-enhancing priorities. Moreover, political deadlock can ensue, leading to a loss in confidence. Taking these probabilities of these scenarios into account, there is a strong chance that Cyril Ramaphosa will remain as president of the country. A survey from Afrobarometer shows that citizens polled are more satisfied with Ramaphosa than they are with government in general. Ramaphosa enjoys a firm level of support across the provinces, the leagues, the National Executive Council, and the ANC's alliance partners. However, if support falls significantly for the ANC in the upcoming elections, the probability of Ramaphosa securing a second term as head of state would indeed be lower. The uncertain political climate casts a long shadow on the economy and has acted as a major constraint for investment prospects in the country for the better part of a decade. An evolving political spectrum and economic projections underscore a nation in flux. The outcomes of these elections will not just determine governance, but also shape the economic discourse, depending on political players' willingness and ability to take the difficult decisions needed to enable a higher level of growth while preserving fiscal prudence. South Africa's future hinges on bridging socio-economic divides, navigating logistical hurdles, and harnessing the power of a politically engaged and empowered society. Your vote truly counts. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sanisha. I will now again hand over to Sanisha Pakisami, who will have a discussion with our guest speaker, Ralph Mathekga, a political analyst who will discuss considerations that could set you at ease during an election year investing jitters. Thank you for joining us today, Sanisha and Ralph. Please take it away.
Thank you, Matula. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Ralph Mathekga, an independent political analyst, well renowned for his thought-provoking analysis on South African politics. Welcome, Ralph. We are really honored to have you here today with us, especially in the run-up to the general elections. And I think, most people are calling this the most pivotal elections that we've seen since the dawn of democracy. And we know that in this context, we are still struggling with a challenging economic environment. And I think as South Africans, we know that we can't just take that big hammer approach and try and fix everything at the same time. So I'd be keen to open our discussion just by hearing, what do you think are some of the main economic challenges that we can address as South Africans in order to correct the economic and social ills?
Thank you so much, Tanisha. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be chatting to you about elections, about politics, about society. And we are going into these elections where it seems as if everything matters, and it appears as if everything matters. You spoke about the economic conditions, a sense of crisis in the country, performance of government. Some people have pointed to capacity challenges in government. And when you look at this election, it brings a lot of expectations. We expect the elections to resolve or answer a lot of questions that have been left outstanding in South Africa for a while. And there is also a great deal of expectations that South Africa is going to make this some kind of a leap. And again, there is nothing wrong with it. People are entitled to have expectations, like citizens and voters, about the elections. If it were up to me, I'll tell you, I'll postpone these elections. Why? Everything else matters. You got a sense that, I have a sense that I wish we could pause a little bit, attend to a lot of problems, electricity, get the economy going, resolve these things and get to a point where maybe we are calm and we can have elections. But those are just my thinking. It will never happen that way. Some will say that's why elections are important, to calm and resolve these issues. And we are going into these elections with a wide sense of expectations. I don't know if elections are going to meet those expectations, or we will look for answers in the subsequent elections. It's fascinating to look at elections. You get elections that do not meet your expectations, just wait for another elections. They will come.
Now, I think it's quite important that you say that. I don't think that there are many South Africans that couldn't agree with you that there are economic challenges that seem to be a little bit more pertinent than resolving for the next political regime in South Africa. I think there are a lot of economic ills that need to be sorted out. And I think in that light, what's quite reflective of that is the low voter turnout we've seen over the last couple of elections. Yeah. Particularly if you look at the youth. Yeah. We've even seen quite a vast number of youth not even bothering to register to vote, to really exercise their democratic right and cast that ballot on the day. And in light of that voter turnout, do you think that this time will be any different? Will we see any shift in voter turnout, especially with regards to what we've seen globally? It seems to be, not really a South African phenomenon, but that disenfranchisement seems to be a bit of a global phenomenon playing out. And I heard quite an interesting argument that, given that the African National Congress or the ruling party faces this real chance of potentially slipping below 50% for the first time since 1994, that you might actually see voter turnout increasing, the mobilization of those urban voters. So your thoughts on that?
And voter turnout is very, very interesting because it depends on a lot of things. Depends on the rain. If you have election during the day that there is rain, there is a possibility that rain can suppress turnout. If it's too cold, it's winter, it just happened to be that day when it bites, it's another factor that you just don't know until that day. How is it going to affect turnout? But I think in South Africa, we already have a sense as to what can we expect. And the concern that have been raised is that we don't have a distinct youth vote. We've got a large proportion of the youth as part of our population. Like Africa, South Africa, the youth they form quite a larger part of the population. Some have said because of that we are losing the youth dividends. We are not gaining from them, getting them employed and so forth. But the trouble in our society, including unemployment, are also concentrated within the youth. So that's why there is this expectations that you really expect the youth to come out in their high numbers and go vote. But that's not what is going to happen. It has been spoken about in the past. It's never happened that way. Is it good? Is it bad? South Africa's voter turnout is generally high. generally. I mean, in a normal functioning democracy where people are not forced to vote, where people are not compelled to go vote, you know, in certain countries, you get fined for not voting. But we don't have that here. So if you look at that, you look at our voter turnout, you could say it's still relatively high. I know there's been concern that if the voter turnout become quite suppressed or look suppressed in this coming election, there's going to be quite problems. I don't think we should be worried so much. A week ago, I was in a forum with one of the chairperson of the IEC, Mr. Sai Mamabolo, mentioned very interesting in that meeting that the youth number was quite good there. Interestingly, women, highest number of people who registered to vote in these elections as well. And when you look at these groups, you want to be saying, you want to see a group coming and representing a distinct voice. But that is not the case. South Africa's youth does not vote as a distinct youth. And that's not a big deal. What that actually means is that it could be the case that the youth believe the system will deal with their concerns as a system. There is no need to have a peculiar or a particular program to deal with the youth. That's why the youth in South Africa does not actually distinguish itself as a distinct group. Look at other parties that are meant to court the youth. How are they? The EFF, one of the parties that went out to target the youth. But you look at the proportion that they're getting of young people, it's not significant. So actually, I can say South Africa does not have a distinct youth vote. There is nothing bad. It actually says maybe the youth believes the mainstream politics can address their concern. As long as I don't see the youth going out of the system, disrupting the system, but remaining and participating like everybody else within the mainstream, then the system is fine. There is no need to have that distinct youth vote in order for us to understand that the youth have got a concern. Maybe the broader policy will deal with that. And I think generally South Africa's youth are also within other political parties. And we're also a conservative society. Let's be honest. Who wants to be led by very young people sometimes? I'm not saying, but look at our society. We are a conservative society. The average age of a political leader in South Africa, the last time I measured it, it was 61. So when you see younger leaders, you still remain an exception to see them. Maybe they will be coming over a period of time. But where we are, it's still okay. It doesn't mean it's a loss if we cannot mobilize the youth as a distinct group. Maybe what we can ask is, are our policies addressing everybody else's concern, including the youth, before the youth can go on the route of maybe disrupting the system. The concern is if the youth disrupt. Our youth are not disruptive. I'm not saying they are in a good position, but they've learned to function within political parties, and it's not bad.
I think it's an important consideration, to think whether the youth can find a home, a political home within the mainstream parties, especially at this juncture of our political landscape where we've just seen, a proliferation of political parties just mushrooming in the last while. So I think, the last number I may have spotted there, almost more than 350 political parties now registering with the Independent Electoral Commission to participate in the next general elections. And, I think what you say is a lot of these political leaders are effectively having defected from the mainstream political parties in the hope that they can try and woo back some of these disillusioned voters, maybe in the youth or maybe in other age cohorts. But I think, there are two ways of viewing that, and I'm quite interested to hear what your opinion is on it. So with this record number of parties, there is almost a good tilt you can put on that and say South Africa is experiencing a very vibrant democracy. Yeah. The negative side of that coin is to say, well, does the number of political parties mushrooming in this political landscape actually reflect voter discontent with this established political system?
That's a very difficult question and a very interesting question. I mean, how do we explain the emergence of new parties, older parties, established parties struggling to remain or to even consolidate? You look at the youth, you look at whether the youth, and I don't want to talk about the youth only, I want to talk about women, other identity groups as well that are capable of organizing themselves into political project. We are seeing these parties coming out. We don't see much of youthful parties. Again, there are a lot of parties that have come out now. You're speaking about over 350 parties. It gets worse. I've seen 1,000 parties in the DRC elections, for example. It gets worse. And whenever I see a longer ballot, it's scary. People feel like, yeah, it actually means we have not matured. But I want to say that let's be kind to ourselves. Let's not be too hard on ourselves. When people believe they can form political parties, organize political project and gain representation, that's better. It's much better. It is up to them as they participate over a period of time to realize that maybe as a party, we are not achieving what we want. We need to merge with that other party, maybe coalesce and achieve something else. Let it be if that is the case. But I'm not averse to the idea of proliferation. They call it proliferation of smaller parties, the emergence of smaller parties. I don't think there is a problem. It actually means voters want that. I've seen it in the 2021 local government election where I said voters were throwing the votes all over the place. They were giving a new party votes as they were coming in. I mean, the 3%ers, some parties got that 3% without knowing what they stand for. But what does that mean? Does it mean our voters are not thinking about it? No, it means that voters are actually showing confidence in formal representation. But they don't find the existing political parties sufficiently or adequate representation of their concern. That's why they're going to give 3% to a party that has not done anything. But I really have much trust in those voters, because instead of walking away from electoral processes, competitive process, instead of saying we don't believe in parties altogether, they are saying that we believe in parties, but this one that exists, we don't think they fully capture what we stand for. We will give it a try and give it to other political parties and make sure they come in. Hence, you have this long ballot. And if you look at South Africa, a country of over 60 million, historical inequalities, differences, a very dynamic, multicultural society, I don't think there should be anything wrong in having a fewer political parties. At some point, as our democracy matures, some parties will fall off, because they realize that, but that which we stand for can be achieved there, can be achieved there. So I don't see the emergence of newer parties as a crisis, but I know it is an irritant to existing parties that want to build that sense of existing, a sense of dominance. I mean, if you are the DA, you are the ANC, you are a bigger party. Yes, of course, you will be suspicious of smaller parties because they are chipping away the votes from you as a bigger party. They are pushing you into coalition, into some kind of a co-governance, and you don't want that. So that's what we have seen. But generally, all in all, the emergence of smaller parties is a reflection of the vibrancy of democracy. Of course, it gets worse when you have 2,000 parties, but we are not there, and I think we can just see how far it goes.
I think it's an interesting trend to see how mature the electorate is becoming in South Africa. As you say, they're willing to give a smaller party 3% without them actually having to lay any groundwork in terms of turning around the economic story, just to kind of get that narrative going again. And you mentioned the Democratic Alliance, or the DA, which is also quite interesting, because the DA was one of those parties that tried to work very hard since the last election to almost rebrand themselves so that they can capture a more wider array of the electorate, and again, getting into some of those demographic groupings that they weren't very prominent in before. Do you think they've been successful at rebranding themselves? Do you think we're going to see that coming out in terms of the voter level of support they get in this next election?
The DA, they've been having problem, a bit of stagnancy there on the margins. I mean, they haven't grown in the previous elections. The last time they grew maybe was 2016 or so. They have not grown significantly. And I think that they are concerned about that. There is the idea that they have reached a ceiling within their traditional constituents. and therefore they need to go to other constituency. There is a mentioning of getting the black vote, the black middle class vote, as we refer to that. And the DA is struggling. But we also need to understand South Africa's politics is very fluid. These parties themselves are displaced. I mean, we talk about them every day. We want to get a sense of where South Africa's politics is going by looking at these parties. But I can tell you that they themselves are displaced. They themselves are just out of their depth. They're trying to survive. I mean, things are very fluid here. You are trying to consolidate as the Democratic Alliance. You have got smaller parties coming out, some of the prominent leaders leaving your party, taking away a small piece of your morality with them. Just that small piece, incrementally, you have to respond why black leaders are not being able to survive within. And then we're going back to the difficult race question within South Africa's politics. And unfortunately, there is nothing you can do. You have to open yourself to this debate as the Democratic Alliance. You cannot reduce the DA's challenge in growth to a single factor of the question of race and fitting. It's quite complex. A very fluid political system. The DA trying to grow outside the Western Cape in places such as Gauteng, where they depend on some of the local leaders here, ultimately finding it difficult to control those leaders at some point as they enter into agreement locally based on some of the local consideration. So it's a very difficult time now to be an established political party in South Africa. It's a very difficult time. They are displaced. They are trying to manage the political system that we are saying they dominate, and ultimately they're actually leading it from behind. They are not fully dominating it. They are struggling. And this is the age of a new party. What is the most exciting thing in South Africa? It is the unknown. It is a new party because we don't know it. How can we be so excited about the unknown? And we know that, unfortunately, that's just where we are, or I should not say unfortunately, maybe even fortunately. It is fascination with this politics of the unknown because the known political projects are not attractive enough. That's just the way it is now. Is it a crisis of democracy? Not necessarily. It's part of the evolution. It's part of the development of our democracy. And I think we should stay strong as the people and understand these are some of the challenges and irritations that come with democratic processes.
You know, speaking about, just carrying on this process and sticking it through, it comes to mind the third largest political party that we saw out of the 2019 elections, the Economic Freedom Fighters. Support them, don't support them. They've managed to do something that many of the other smaller players did not manage to achieve, and that was to become more than just a one-hit wonder.
Yeah.
And I think given the splintering of the electorate today, it is, a new question comes about that whether the EFF will actually manage to retain that momentum going forward, or will we actually see support being chipped away from them as well as we see with the other two mainstream parties?
The EFF is becoming an established party. You play into the election once, you go into the election twice, and again, they are playing into power in other cities. They are being part of government here and there, even at a restrained level. So how are they? How have they been? I mean, you cannot ignore them. Whether or not you agree with the EFF, the reality is that they have managed to shake South Africa's democracy. They went to parliament, and when they came in, they said people were sleeping there, literally, and then people started seeing what's happening in parliament. And they've done it by presenting themselves as this party that doesn't play at the center. You can say they're an outlier in a sense of they're a party that is far. They're not inside. They're not part of the establishment. They're in parliament, but they've got the right to go and take matters in their own hands and go disrupt a shop when there is an issue of a social problem there. They play into formal politics, but they reserve their right to do what they want and address an issue the way in which they see it fit. So this is a party that has played it both ways, and they've been successful. The question is, where to from now? I mean, the challenge with populist policies, even if they are linked to the true issues on the ground, is that you actually reach diminishing return very quickly. How radical can you get? I mean, you push it and then you get 10%, and then at some point you realize it doesn't matter how extreme and how radical I'm getting, I'm no longer attaining support. There isn't much of reward, which comes down to South Africa's electorate, because the voters do speak. South Africa's voters do not excessively reward radicalism. They do not. I don't know, are they conservative voters? Maybe. I mean, you look at radical parties like the EFF. If you look at the level of inequality in South Africa, you look at the challenges that we have, the EFF should be sitting at 30%. But no, voters are saying, yes, we like hearing you, but we don't want to hear you every day, okay? We want to give you a certain percentage up to a certain point. We respect you to an extent that you remind, or you keep being a reminder that the democratic system has to be this way, but not to a point of saying we need to get rid of this system and have what is being proposed as part in the mainstream. Voters are very purposeful, and I have to say they're very smart. They don't vote by accident. If they give you 2% as a party, it's because they knew what they were doing, the voters. They wanted to give you that 2% to see what you can do with it. That's what they're doing with other parties. With parties that are radical, they've given them the vote that they've given them, and it is up to those parties to see whether do you become less radical to increase your vote, or where are the rewards when it comes to increasing your electoral share.
But Ralph, this is a bit of a reminder that, South Africa doesn't act in isolation. This is almost what is playing out in the US economy with Donald Trump. It's the shock factor. Yeah. And if he does, get a second term in politics, there will need to be an additional layer of shock factor for your electorate to continue to support you. I think in South Africa, the EFF has been that prominence behind the radical factor. And we wouldn't be able to have this discussion without speaking about former President Jacob Zuma's Mkhonto weSizwe party, or the MK party. Yeah. And I'm quite keen to hear whether you think that they are going to be the next destabilizing factor. Now, we spoke about some of the smaller parties being these one-hit wonders.
Yeah.
But there's something a little bit unique about the MK party in that they came with a political ideology. They came with, ideas in their manifesto, because it is almost seen to be a de facto break-off party, a faction of the ANC that already had that established groundwork for a political party. Do you think that's enough to get them into that political discourse to really shake things up a little further?
I think it's about political power, and people do not just form political parties because they felt good and they just woke up loving people. There should be realistic prospect of accessing power, and it is there through this. And accessing power is ultimately going to be influencing decisions on where resources are being directed. So the MK party, realizing the credibility crisis of the ANC, they emerged as a very attractive, almost, I don't want to say franchise of the ANC, because these parties sometimes, they take from their mother party, if you like, and they reconfigure their position. But the MK party, it is one of the main irritants to the ANC. First of all, they did not want to mince their words. They went straight to that moral from the history of the ANC, calling themselves an MK party. And guess what? They went to court and they were challenged. They won. They kept on winning and winning and winning on the name, on taking the ANC. And I mean, the MK is supposed to be, if you really want to build a different brand, really, you are genuine about doing something, why would you appropriate something that you know exactly belongs to another political party? The idea of MK. They did that. Why? It's because they are going into the same space that the ANC is. They are going to challenge the ANC. They are going to chip away the ANC's electoral base. It is because it's doable. These parties are going to position themselves, first of all, low-hanging fruit, doable politics. Can you actually access power? What is the next step? Can you find yourself around the table when coalitions are being negotiated? Yes. Will the MK party find itself around the table when coalitions are negotiated for KZN government? Most likely, yes. Because of the way in which things have developed there. The NC has always been weak in KZN. So this is one party that has come out that way to chip away on the existing party. Interesting is that in the subsequent election, there might be another party to do a better job than what the MK is doing. So you have more of these parties coming out. That is why they do not consolidate. They come through, get 4-5%. The lucky ones can just increase a little bit with a marginal increment. Usually we see a decline, leadership problems. Already the MK party has already fired people even before they could go to the polls. They're already having a leadership crisis. Again, that's the culture of political parties in South Africa. They all have leadership problems at different degrees because it reflects on just the political culture that we have.
Ralph, you introduced the C word, coalitions. And I know this is an unfair question to ask as we head into elections, because as we head into elections, it's always known as the silly season. And, votes can change on a whim. But I think our viewers will be quite interested, and I'm also quite interested, just to hear your thoughts on how we're going to see the vote split coming out of the general elections. The C word, the coalition word, we might see this on a provincial level, but there's also a chance, if we look at the polls, that we might actually see this playing out on a national level. And I think, South Africa has a bit of a reputation for not having such good coalitions at a local government level in some areas. Given that since 2016, a number of hung councils, we saw a lot of displacement occurring there with political parties. But in that same breath, of the top performing coalitions, I think the last number I saw, there were at least 4 that were in fact governed by coalition governments, which tells us that there might actually be a space in the current political discourse for coalitions to have a more successful way of improving the economic and social outcomes for SA. So quite key to hear what you think is going to really evolve out of these election results, and what happens with the coalition side of things.
I'm quite positive about coalitions. And I think for me, it's a question of whether you're going to have weaker coalition or stronger coalitions. And even weaker coalitions are still good for democracy, by the way. I mean, coalition entail co-governance, something that is lacking in South Africa's political culture. South African parties have got this sense of majoritarianism, whereby parties always believe that if you deposit political power in a single place in a party, it will most likely be exercised effectively. We have seen how this thing went about. The ANC was unchallenged for quite a while, and we have had a problem of accountability, oversight issue there, Parliament, where we ended up with state capture inquiry, which is the widest inquiry to ask who has been doing something wrong, very wide inquiry. So if you look at that, shift to coalition will actually mean more people have to discuss for one thing to be decided. There will be delay in decision making, but we'll get used to it. We're going to learn to function within that. Suddenly you have 5 parties to talk to, parties, interest groups, and so forth to talk to before you pass a policy. When you go through various iterations, various parties, interested parties, stakeholders, the policy changes and shifts. That's what policies do. If you come and discuss a policy with me, when you leave slightly altered, you go to someone else slightly altered. At the end of the day, you have a policy that reflects, not necessarily to be saying directly the views of the people, but somewhere, somehow, there is more consultation on policy than it has been the case before. That's what we have been lacking. We need that in the coalitions. So coalitions are going to be good. We don't need grand coalitions to function. People tend to think for coalitions to work, you need this amazing group of people that are so focused. You're going to lock them in a dark room and they will agree on point A to Z. No, it doesn't work that way. You can find what I call pay-as-you-go coalition. You fill up the airtime on an issue. You want to decide on economic policy. You have got a governing coalition at another level, but now when it comes to various policy projects, you shop around for policy. If you are in a coalition, I'll give an example. If the NC and the EFF are in coalition, and then the ANC want to push a policy that the EFF does not like, but they're already in a coalition. What that will mean is that the EFF will find it incumbent upon themselves not to attack the ANC on that policy. What they will then do as the EFF will be to say to the ANC, go look for someone to help you pass that, but we are not attacking you. Isn't that how things function? Next time is the EFF wanting concession. The ANC say, we don't want to support that, but we are not going to attack it. So go find support. That's what I say, pay as you go. You go find a minister who can support this, and it becomes co-governance. And at the end, you have got decisions that reflect the society more than the decisions that go through one place because of the belief that the truth is found in one place. That's fallacy.
Ralph, I think, it's quite difficult to always, get beyond the short term, especially when the risks in the political calendar are as high as they are today. But I also want to get your views on sort of the long-term political cycles and how these evolve in South Africa. I look at the ANC being the single party that's very dominant in South Africa. And I look at, a more formalized and mature democracy like the US or the UK, where you've got a two-party state effectively. So in the US, you've got the Democrats and Republicans, and over in the UK, you've got the Labour and the Conservative parties. Does South Africa, with our 350 political parties, ever get to that point where we can be a two-party state?
It's not necessary. I mean, two-party state, the belief is that, when we studied political science, we were told far back that it's the symbol of maturity, but it's the US system matured as it is. We have seen the insurrection, Donald Trump and so forth. One of the biggest concerns that some people have in the US will be that the mainstream as they represent us is too far from the people. And the mainstream is that two-party. So it does not always have to end at a two-party state. We can have permanent coalitions. It's okay. It's not bad at all. The question is learning to function within that institutional framework of co-governance. South Africa has got strong institutions. You need civil society. You don't always need strong political parties to drive political projects in society. No. You need political parties that function within civil society, voters that are well informed, more options there. If groups feel they need to be represented in the system, we have not even entered identity politics. I can even challenge your viewers to say, if they think that we have got fewer parties, they haven't even gone far. We don't even have the LGBTQ party. You see, we haven't started. We don't have a rural party. We don't have this and that party. We still have a long way to go before maybe we coalesce into that two-party. But by the look of things, I think the cookie frame of two-party is not going to work for us.
So taking this 40,000 feet long-term political view, I would argue that since 2008, we have operated in a very different economic regime, much higher levels of volatility. We've seen, GDP and things like inflation, interest rates really oscillate in quite a big manner over the last couple of years. It's also operated against a backdrop of much higher geopolitical risk, higher political risk in general. And it's also been accompanied by this element of stepping away from globalization. But even though we have less globalization than what we did before, or less of a drive for it, we are also seeing more political groupings, more economic groupings. So if you think about the Global South movement or the BRICS alliance expanding, can South Africa ever get a louder voice on the political stage to really represent the African continent and maybe even more, to talk about things like global climate change or security threats? What do we need to do to get there, or are we already there?
Very simple. Get your story right back home first. I mean, even in old classical days, if you go read about foreign affairs, you can't do good foreign affairs if you can't do good home affairs, to start with. And I'm not saying you need a single party that is going to define the local project and therefore you can have better foreign affairs. All I'm saying is that you need stronger, more parties. You need to strengthen your local project. You need to be able to build a state that has got capacity locally. And then from then, you can then go on foreign affairs. It becomes very difficult for countries to pronounce themselves beyond their borders if they cannot get it so well. Who's going to take you seriously, by the way? If you go out, you take to the international podium, and then you pronounce even on those international issues, but back home, you are not getting it right. So if you get it right, it will align very well. But we have seen recently some of the countries not getting it right at home and deliberately trying to obfuscate that, eclipse that by undertaking some foreign diplomatic ventures and misadventures that you look at them and you see that this is an admission that I just can't get it well back home. That's why I'm doing this.
Ralph, it's been amazing to have you on, and your input has been so insightful. I'm sure our viewers have gained quite a lot from it. I just wanted to tie it back and hand it over to you. At the beginning, you said, it's quite important to not look at this election as a make it or break it. Yeah. We have been through pivotal elections before. Yeah. And in that, I think, our clients are sometimes a little bit nervous when we go into something that has a lot of event risk. Yeah. And we often tell our clients that we do diversify the portfolios. Yeah. So that we don't always, have all our eggs in one basket for one particular economic or political outcome. Is there anything that you'd finally like to share with the viewers in terms of how to actually view going into these elections, the type of risk that is associated with it, and maybe just to leave them with a sense of comfort?
Yeah, I have observed South Africa for years, and I can assure you, this is not a country that wakes up with radical moves. South Africa is a country of gradualists. Yes, they talk radical the whole day, no doubt about it. But it's not a country of people who make unpredictable radical moves. So whatever these elections are likely to bring, it's already setting in. And what is it that is being setting in? Parties need to talk to each other to pass policy. The NC has been trying to talk to others as well around expropriation and so forth. So we are entering that stage of co-governance. And it's not tragic. I really think a better country will come out of this as our political system is evolving. And I'm very positive, but I'm realistically positive as well.
Thank you so much, Ralph. I really look forward to chatting to you again soon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for sharing such great insights, Sanisha and Ralph. Next, we've got Nomatam Sangakosa, a portfolio manager at Equilibrium, who will discuss whether markets have priced in for later or greater during the South African elections. Pleasure to have you join us today, Tami.
Thank you, Matula, and good day, everyone. You have listened to interesting insights from Dr. Ralph and Sanisha on the upcoming local elections. Have markets already priced in these risks, or should we prepare for later and greater? Let's find out. Reviewing our asset class returns, we start off with global equity. The MSCI All Countries World Index returned 11.8% in Rand terms for the quarter. Outside of the US, the best performing market for the quarter was once again Japan. Global bonds, however, experienced a subdued quarter. The narrative of stickier inflation, resilient economic activity, and the US Federal Reserve backpedaling on the dovish tone resulted in a sell-off in global bonds. The asset class in Rand terms therefore delivered a muted 0.6% in returns. Global cash, as represented by the ICE BOFA, continued to benefit from a high interest rate cycle, gaining 4.3% over the quarter, in Rand terms, of course. Casting our eye on the currency, the Rand weakened by 3.5% against the US dollar over the quarter, to close off at 18.94. This then enhanced the performance of global asset classes. Casting our eye to local asset classes, despite March 2024 being a much stronger month, declines in the first 2 months saw the JSE Capped Swix Index closing the quarter 2.3% in the red. The largest detractors were financials and resources, down 6 and 1.6% respectively. Local bonds, as represented by the ALBI, were down 1.8% for the quarter, as investors remain concerned about South Africa's fiscal outlook. The largest detractors were bonds in the 7 to 12-year maturity buckets, as well as the 12-year plus maturity buckets. We term these bonds longer dated and ultra longer dated bonds. Despite expectations of interest rate cuts, most notably in the second half of 2024, local cash continues to generate attractive returns due to high short-term yields. The STEFI Composite Index returned 2.1% for the quarter and continued to deliver inflation-beating returns of 8.4% over the last 12 months. Looking forward, the local elections are just around the corner. We will hopefully also have some more insights in terms of the first round of interest rate cuts. South Africa and our global markets are both in a conundrum with regards to when and to what extent interest rate cuts will happen. Upside risks to the inflation outlook, however, continue to stem from a weaker rand and geopolitically driven higher global food and oil prices. Transitioning the discussion to our local model portfolios. During the quarter ended 31 March 2024, our income portfolio underperformed its benchmark and peer group and was negatively impacted by the side pocketing and the write-down of the MyPlan IP Enhanced Income Fund. You would have received communication of this in February. Barring the balanced and growth portfolios, all multi-asset portfolios delivered strong positive returns in the quarter, following, of course, from the rally that took place in global equity. Coherently, the multi-asset portfolios, except for the unconstrained growth portfolio, were ahead of their respective peers during the quarter. All portfolios delivered reasonable returns over their respective time horizons, as indicated by the red frames, with the conservative and the stable portfolios outperforming their respective benchmarks, whilst the relatively more aggressive portfolios, namely the moderate, the balanced, the growth, and the unconstrained growth portfolios, came under pressure. This was primarily due to the continued below-average long-term returns from local growth asset classes, namely local property and local equity, as well as the sell-off that we did see in global asset classes in 2022. Although the degree of underperformance has improved, most notably following last year's rally and the continued rally in global equity that we have witnessed coming into 2024. Performance relative to peers is encouraging, with all multi-asset portfolios, barring the unconstrained growth portfolio, outperforming over their respective time horizons. Remember, we don't manage the portfolios relative to peer groups. However, it does help as a sense check. So what were the drivers of performance in our portfolios? We will use the Equilibrium Balanced Portfolio as a proxy for our discussions. The attribution table in front of you indicates that performance was primarily due by strategic asset allocation, abbreviated SAA, while tactical asset allocation, abbreviated TAA, and manager selection detracted from performance. Pleasingly, the portfolio outperformed both the CPI plus 5% benchmark as well as the ASISA High Equity Peer Group over the past year. This graph illustrates the weighted realized returns from each asset class over the last 12 months to 31 March 2024 relative to our long-term forward-looking expectations. Global equity showed a remarkable rebound that was mainly driven by a pause in interest rates as well as the rally that we did experience in tech and AI stocks as previously discussed. Local bonds underperformed our long-term expectations due to the local elections and fears looming around that, as well as the resultant sell-off in that asset class. The realized returns relative to expected returns in local equity may be indicative of a long-term structural change due to a subdued return potential from this asset class. The remaining asset classes either performed in line with or outperformed our long-term expected returns. As a result, and holistically, the SAA returns are ahead of the benchmark as well as our expectations. Tactical asset allocation speaks to how we underweight, overweight, or take neutral positions on asset classes depending on our short to medium term views. The underweight position in global equity was the largest detractor from performance, as we were underweight an asset class that performed relatively well. Manager selection detracted marginally from performance, casting our eye on the underlying managers. Blue Alpha BCI Equity Fund, which is our quality manager, as well as Visio BCI Unconstrained Fixed Interest Fund, which is more of our conservative duration positioning manager, were significant contributors, while Coronation Global Emerging Markets Flexible Fund, this is our emerging market manager who was overweight China and had the looming risks that stem from the Russia and Ukraine conflict, was a significant detractor from performance. Looking forward at our TAA decisions for this quarter relative to last quarter. Locally, we've amended our views on SA bonds from neutral to overweight to a neutral position. What that means is that we will be trimming down slightly on this asset class. Following through from the earlier conversations, we remain cautious with the upcoming national elections and the continued market uncertainty on global monetary policy decisions. Although the macroeconomic backdrop for South African equities is not favorable, SA equity displays attractive valuations, and we therefore have retained a neutral to overweight position. SA property, on the other hand, experienced a remarkable year last year, and although we retain a neutral position to this asset class, we are cautious of the limited upside due to the good news of potential interest rate cuts having already been priced in. We, however, execute for property using a flexible mandate. What that means is that the fund manager is able to make tilts between local and global property, depending, of course, on where they see opportunities. We are upweighting our global equity position. Our view is that there remains a non-Magnificent Seven or a non-AI global equity market that displays fair valuations. With the risks of a global recession starting to fall away, global equity does display upside potential. With regards to the remaining asset classes, we have retained neutral positions. In closing, we'd like to leave you with a famous quote by Warren Buffett that says, "We don't have to be smarter than the rest. We have to be more disciplined than the rest." Markets are always threatened by a multitude of economic, political, and geopolitical risks, which could lead to volatility ahead. It is, however, important to remain focused on the long-term investment objective and not to be distracted by short-term noise. If there hasn't been a change in investor circumstances, the importance of staying invested cannot be emphasized enough. We hope that you have found this session to be informative, and thank you for your time today. We look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Tammy. And now we've got Jade Kosh, a portfolio manager from our London office, who will discuss our global models and opportunities in the global environment. Welcome, Jade.
Thank you, Matula. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about, firstly, a recap on the team that we have here at Momentum Global Investment Management. I'm going to talk a bit about the performance of the portfolios, the macro backdrop, how that then translates into some of the performance drivers for the portfolios. I'm going to talk about our asset allocation views, and then lastly I'm going to finish up talking about our general outlook. So firstly, the team. So I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce myself. You might have seen my photo or seen my name in previous presentations, but it's nice to talk to you for the first time here today. I joined Momentum Global Investment Management about 15 months ago. I co-manage some of the portfolios with my colleague Richard Stutley, who you all probably know very well. And then I also lead on our responsible investment efforts here in the UK. So this slide really is just a reminder that although it is Richard and I who are running the portfolios on a day-to-day basis, we're supported by a much larger, wider team of around 20 individuals. These individuals have a wide range of expertise, and it's a very experienced team, and it's very helpful to draw on that expertise, that asset allocation knowledge, that particular fund-specific knowledge when we are running these portfolios. So just a recap on the Equilibrium model portfolios, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. The three portfolios, cautious, manage and growth. The cautious portfolio, as it says on the tin, is our least risky portfolio with a higher allocation to bonds and a smaller allocation to equities. The growth portfolio on the other end of that spectrum is our riskiest portfolio with the highest allocation to risky assets, or namely equities. And then in the middle, we've got the managed portfolio, which is the balance between equities and fixed income. And all of these portfolios have an allocation to real assets, or in this case, property, gold, and also cash. So looking at long-term performance here, I think it's good to zoom out and just see how the portfolios are doing. All three funds have outperformed their respective performance objectives over time. Obviously, very positive news. You can see here from those lines going up to the right there that the last few months have been very positive for these portfolios on a relative basis, and obviously that's great news as well. So just talking a little bit about some of the drivers. So firstly, global growth is proving to be particularly resilient. And we're seeing this through composite PMIs remaining above 50 across multiple regions. It is the services PMIs that are really driving this number, but more recently we're actually seeing manufacturing PMIs picking up as well, indicating that both services and manufacturing PMIs are both in expansive territory. In addition to this, we're seeing a tight labour market. This slide covers the US, but we're seeing this in other regions as well, such as the UK. You can see here that unemployment remains low, wages remain sticky, and that's particularly within the services industry. And then job openings are coming down, but very slowly and a lot slower than expectations. And what this is all leading into is that inflation is proving to be stickier than expected. It's not coming down at the rate that central banks and investors expected it to come down at. Inflation in the US remains at about 3.5% today, and that's well above the 2% target rate. And what this means is that interest rate cuts are being pushed out. So the expectation here, as you can see from the green line, is that short-term inflation expectations have actually risen. On the positive side of that, longer-term inflation expectations are coming down, and the expectation is that we will get to that 2% mark. It's just that it's going to take longer than we expected. And this chart is an interesting one because it covers a very short time period. So you can see from the green bars here that in January, the expectation was that in multiple regions, so the US, the European Union and the UK, there were going to be around 6 interest rate cuts during 2023. Move forward just 2 months to March, and that red bar indicates that actually the expectation is that we were only going to see around 3 interest rate cuts. And then move forward just 1 more month to April, and the expectation now is that we're only going to get between 1 and 3 interest rate cuts depending on the region that you're looking at, but in the US it stands at around 1 to 2. And that's in a very short amount of time, and it indicates that inflation has been particularly sticky, and the higher for longer narrative is likely to remain in place. So what does this mean for bond markets? So the bond yield across the curve have moved up. Real interest rate expectations have risen, and the 10-year yield now sits at 4.6%. And on the other side of this, it means that fixed income markets have underperformed during the quarter. And we'll talk a little bit more around how that translates into the portfolio a bit later in the presentation. So turning our attention to equities, as you can see from this chart, the equities across various different markets have performed strongly. The narrative that I've just discussed in terms of persistent growth, elevated inflation, a tight labour market, so far that has been positive for equity markets during 2024. And we're seeing this across every single region. So you can see that top line there, that's Japanese equities. They've had a phenomenal time of late. But the thing that I would caution here is that these returns are in local currency. So when we convert this into US dollar terms, unfortunately, the weak Japanese yen means that the Japanese equity returns have actually been quite muted. So the real winning region on this chart here is unsurprisingly US equities, which is indicated by that green line with the star next to it there. And then on the other side of that, we've got Chinese equities, which is the red line at the bottom of this chart, which is the only region that is in negative territory. China has had a bit of a rebound lately, but unfortunately they still face significant headwinds in terms of macroeconomics, geopolitics, and we don't see these really abating anytime soon. So given those headwinds, we're a little bit cautious on China at the moment. And overall, what this means is that developed market equities have done particularly well over the last few months and year to date. And that's because there's a big portion of global equities is made up by that US equity component. And then emerging markets have had a bit of a trickier time, and that's because Chinese equities make up a big portion of that emerging market index. So if we dig a little bit deeper into where these returns are coming from, this chart shows returns throughout 3 different periods, 2 of which denote when we've seen the market bottom out, and then it shows the subsequent rebound performance since then. And what this shows is that during 2023, the tech sector very much dominated returns and was a significant positive performer. But when we look a little bit at more recent performance over the last 3 to 6 months, performance has come from a much more broad base and has come from a lot of different sectors. So for example, if we look at the banking sector, if we look at the insurance sectors, these have been beneficiaries of this higher for longer interest rate narrative for these sectors. And so we've seen positive performance coming from there. And in fact, the banking sector has actually outperformed the technology sector over the past 6 months or so. So maybe just delving a little bit deeper into the performance of the tech stocks, or unsurprisingly, we're looking at the Magnificent Seven. If we look at the performance of the Magnificent Seven over the past 12 months, you can see, phenomenal performance indicated by those red bars. If we look at year-to-date performance, we're no longer talking about 7 magnificent stocks. We're talking about 2, maybe at a push 3 stocks that we could maybe call magnificent, and that's Nvidia and Meta. And what this really highlights is the risk of following those short-term trends. The name Magnificent Seven only came about a year and a half ago, and then a year and a half later, we actually have something like Tesla significantly underperforming. And so, we caution following short-term trends, and we also highlight the importance of not ignoring valuations, because there is risk. There is risk that those valuations will fall, and that will have a negative impact on performance. So just on the subject of valuations, I think it's important to highlight that although the equities market has had a very strong performance over the past year or so and year to date, we still do see pockets of value throughout the market. So on this chart, you can see, denoted by the grey line, that performance has been very strong for the magnificent stocks. However, if we look at that green line, and that's the MSCI World Index, excluding the US, performance isn't phenomenal, and so it indicates that there is still a lot of upside in a lot of different markets. And now turning our attention to the portfolios, you can see the quarterly performance of the cautious, managed and growth portfolios here. And all 3 portfolios have outperformed their performance targets, and they've also outperformed the peer group year to date. which is obviously, great news. And I'll go through some of the performance drivers with you. So firstly, worth touching on fixed income. Within the portfolios, there's a very slight underweight to fixed income within the portfolios, and that has been beneficial to performance. Also, the underlying managers have outperformed their respective indices, and this has also been a key contributor. Within the managed and growth portfolios, there's an allocation to emerging market equities, and the underlying managers within this space, they've outperformed the index, and that as well has been a contributor to performance. Now, looking on the negative side, there were two key detractors. So first of all, the cash allocation within the portfolios was a detractor. And this is because equities did have a strong quarter, and so it would have been better to be fully invested rather than having that allocation to cash. Additionally, the relative performance of the gold portfolio also weighed on performance. The gold price actually hit new highs in March because central banks have been buying up reserves, and because we've seen heightened geopolitics in the Middle East, and gold is seen as a bit of a safe haven. So the asset has done particularly well, but the fund that we have just struggled to keep up due to individual stock selection. But I would say that the fund continues to do well on a long-term basis, whereas a quarter, obviously, we're looking at a very short time frame. So delving a bit more into some of the underlying managers, I think is worth touching on the Momentum Global Equity Fund, given that it's a sizable allocation across the portfolios. So the fund slightly underperformed the benchmark by just 30 basis points. It's not a huge difference, but what drove that underperformance is that slight underweight to Nvidia and Meta. It's a sizable portion of the portfolio, so I think always worth touching on, even if it's not hasn't been a huge driver of under or outperformance. Then, as I mentioned, in the emerging market space, Fidelity has been a significant outperformer. And what's driven their returns is firstly their underweight to Chinese equities, and then also just strong stock selection across multiple regions, and that's really added to returns. I've already touched on the gold portfolios. There's the 91 Global Gold Fund, which actually continues to outperform on a long-term basis, but they just had a slightly tricky quarter from a stock selection perspective. Now, looking at our asset allocation views, over the quarter there was no change to our asset allocation views. We remain slightly underweight equities. We're broadly neutral on fixed income and cash, and then we're slightly overweight alternative assets, so including gold. We think that these assets, have a place in portfolios, certainly as a risk hedge, as we're seeing things like heightened geopolitics, for example. And as a result of this, we didn't make any changes to the Equilibrium Global Model portfolios over the quarter. We remain comfortable with the asset allocation, and we also remain comfortable with the manager lineup as well. So we didn't make any changes. So just finishing on our outlook summary, three key things to touch on. So firstly, inflation remains a concern. Inflation is certainly proving to be stickier than expected, and this means that those interest rate cuts have been pushed out, and the timing of easing of monetary policy has really come in question. But our core view remains the same, and that is that inflation will come down to target. It's just that there are question marks around the timing of that. We still think that there are significant headwinds to economic growth. And we don't think that this is fully discounted into markets. And this is one of the key reasons that we have a slight underweight to equities and a slight overweight to more defensive assets, such as gold and cash. And then lastly, just touching on some of the risks that we're seeing, very important to always keep these in the back of your mind when you're managing a portfolio. But we're seeing many risks in markets, so rising geopolitical tensions, and that's globally. So in the Middle East, the ongoing war in Ukraine with Russia, and then also this sort of rising tension between the US and China, which seems to be ongoing and potentially escalating as well. And then other risks to note, so the knock-on effect of higher interest rates to both the consumer and corporates. We haven't really seen a lot of that play out yet, but it doesn't mean that it's not a risk and it's something that could happen in future. So for these reasons, we remain optimistic about the positioning of the portfolios today, and we think that they are appropriately positioned, given these views. So thank you very much. That's all from me.